If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description.
Chapter 341, Nose to the Grindstone. Nick turned in for the night after dinner as he was quite tired mentally after the past few days' activities. The next 3 days were fairly quiet as he spent the entire time enchanting the ring blanks he smelted to try and work his way through the large number of protection rings he needed to finish for his mission. There was a bonus to this sort of mindless repetitive actions though, as he was quickly growing more and more capable of enchanting more and more rings at once with this specific enchantment. At first it was 20 per reserve, but by the end of the third day he could barely stretch it to 30, putting his total at 360 per day. This lowered the amount of time it would take to complete the mission to about 3 years based on the rough math. He figured that by the end of next year he might finish up if he continued to improve at his current rate, maybe even soon if he was lucky. On the fourth day though, he received a visitor in the form of one Sirius Black who wanted almost desperately to be of help to his friend. Thanks to the data Nick received from his transformation to and from his animal form, Nick identified the parts of the curse he needed to target for correction and which ones served a different purpose. Sirius was allowed to stay on for the rest of the week as an assistant teacher for Lupin, during which time he spent as much time as possible with Harry. Nick on the other hand had locked himself away within the workshop over this time, drafting, scrapping, and restarting his creation of an enchantment for Lupin's ring. The holiday break came without him even knowing as he poured his undivided attention into this project, only stopping to eat, drink and use the restroom as needed. "You should take a day off, child, you are running yourself ragged like this," Celebrimbor said, concerned at the pace Nick was holding. He wasn't alone in his concern either, as Helena, Dusk, and the professors were all worried about him burning out. Nick also knew that this was unhealthy, but this matter needed to be done as soon as possible as the next full moon was a mere 3 weeks away. He could relax once the mission was finished, but for now he felt that only his maximum effort would suffice as no mistakes could be made. Still he relented and took an entire day of nothing but relaxation and recovery. "It's amazing to see the sort of progress you can make if you take a moment to de-stress," he thought, looking at the newest enchantment design he had created in his realm. By itself it appeared disharmonious and incomplete, which was because it was. That was the unique thing about this enchantment, its incompleteness was what made it work to complete the curse and turn it into a blessing. This was the reason he wanted to get it done before the next full moon, as it was only at that time that its full effects could be seen. He didn't make some sort of patch for the curse that masked the problems it had. No, what he made was a sort of magical organ transplant type thing. On the night of the full moon, when the lunar energy blankets the world and the curse draws it into Lupin, the enchantment will creep into his body at that moment and place itself over the broken parts that need fixing. The transformation will be excruciating for Lupin, but once the enchantment successfully suppresses the broken parts of the curse and its parts meld with the rest of the magic, a dramatic change shall commence. No longer will the cells turn cancerous and destructive, but rather cancerous in a positive, reinforcing manner with a set limit to prevent them from turning dangerous. The life force will grow more powerful and harmonious as the wrong parts no longer are there, having been replaced by the good ones. The final touch Nick added though was that after this first transformation the pain will no longer exist for Lupin, and in fact, given enough time, the original curse's broken parts will be overwritten entirely. This means that not only will Lupin be able to freely control his transformation like a true animagus, but he will not even need the enchantment anymore after a certain amount of time. The best part in Nick's opinion though was that he corrected the disproportional form of the body after transformation into a powerful and perfect hybrid of wolf and man. Of course this all hinges on the next full moon going perfectly after this ring is put on. Nick thought seriously. Chapter 342, Lupi Veneri. Ring, Lupi Veneri. Grade, Mythical. Abilities, Autozizing, Lycanthropy Blend, Life Force Correction, Control. Mythical ability, Blessing of the Moon. Under the light of the full moon the wearer is more powerful in their transformed state. Description: a grand creation made to repair and replace all that was broken or wrong with the magic of lycanthropy, and builds upon that foundation to turn it into a blessing instead. System appraisal: a complex ring that will change history and carve its name in myth created by an established ring smith. Analyzing the silver ring in the shape of a howling wolf head, Nick was surprised to see that it was a mythical grade ring. He hadn't even noticed that he had added a transcendent ability to the enchantment, which confused him for a moment until he figured it out. It was an accident on his part in truth, as he made the enchantment to use the moon's effect to take root in Lupin's body and act on the curse. This integral feature didn't vanish when the enchantment replaced the curse's parts, but rather the moon's light now causes the person wearing the ring to get a buff in the points that the enchantment held sway over. A happy accident to be sure, but an unintended one nonetheless that Nick didn't feel he could take pride in as a result. I can now proudly say that you have reached my own level of skill, so congratulations are due. Celebrimbor said with a smile after reading the results of the analysis alongside Nick. Having been bound to the system, he was able to see it just fine, and as a result was now certain that Nick had almost fully digested the sum of his inheritance. Perhaps he couldn't weave whole runic sentences into his works yet, but that was due to power and age instead of pure skill. Nick grinned widely at this, as he knew that this was right and that wherever he takes the crafting style after this will be by his own work and effort. Now I just need to see the fruit of my labor on the next full moon, he said with a smile, and finally relaxed. It was a serious weight off of his mind, as he finally had some room to take it easy for a while. Perhaps he still needed to work on the rings of protection, but he had always thought of that as an unpressing concern. After all, he had years for that task, while the matter of Lupin needed to be at the forefront of his effort. Checking the time, he found that it was only around 4 in the afternoon and left his workshop. He felt the cold chill of the air and the snowy landscape outside the windows as he walked towards the Dada office that Lupin was likely in. The hallways were nearly empty, as most of the student population had left for the holidays. This included all of his friends, including Harry, who was now living with Sirius in the Black ancestral home after it had been fixed up and cleaned. It was a strange thing, according to Harry, as he had never known what it was like to have a caring family until now. Nick was happy for his friend and honestly hoped he wouldn't get dragged into the upcoming mess Grindelwald was going to release on the world. It didn't take Nick long to reach the office without any foot traffic obstructing his way. Lupin was sitting on an armchair at the corner of the room reading a book when Nick entered. The man marked his page and set the book on the arm table next to him after seeing who was visiting him. "What can I do for you today, Nick?" he asked politely. Nick grinned and tossed the wolf ring to him. Lupin caught the ring and looked at it with wide eyes, as he had a suspicion as to what it was but was afraid to ask and risk disappointment. "That ring is the second best one I have ever made, and come the next full moon should change your life for the better," Nick said honestly with no small amount of pride. Lupin's eyes watered when he heard this, such a small thing, and yet. He spoke softly and stared at the ring as if trying to memorize its every detail through teary eyes. Nick couldn't really blame him all that much, as he had suffered that curse for so long and now he held the cure in his hands. Perhaps it wasn't a true cure in that it didn't strip the curse from him, but it couldn't even be considered a curse anymore thanks to the ring, but a blessing. Chapter 343, Not So Quiet Flight. Lupin wiped his eyes and calmed himself. "I am sorry for showing you such an unsightly state, you cannot possibly even begin to imagine what this means to me," he said sincerely. Nick just chuckled. "I'm afraid you have celebrated a tad early. Your next transformation is going to be especially painful as the enchantment takes hold. After that, though, the transformation will be little different than that of an animagus," he said honestly. Lupin didn't look bothered by this, though it has always been painful, so it shouldn't make much difference, he said, not grasping the sort of pain Nick was actually referring to. "I'm afraid you are not understanding me clearly, so let me give you a comparison to help. What you will be experiencing will likely be comparable to being hit with the Cruciatus curse. It might even drive you mad if you take it lightly," Nick said seriously. Lupin lost most of his enthusiasm at that knowledge, but was determined to shake off the shackles of his curse even if it meant suffering greatly. He put the ring on his pointer finger where it shrank down to fit perfectly. "I'll take my chances, but thank you for the warning," he said with a smile. Nick left after that, since he had done what he came here for and thus had no reason to stay. From the office he went outside and took out his broom so he could relax a bit in the sky. His broom was nothing like it was when he first got it, however, as he had long decoded the runes and upgraded it to a stupid degree. Massively increased speed, durability, control as well as reduced air resistance made it so that for those watching he seemed to vanish from his spot on the ground the moment he mounted the broom. The loud crack they heard after that and the shockwave that followed it told a very different story, however. Nick had broken the sound barrier the moment he took off and was already high in the sky in mere seconds. The entire castle heard the sound barrier break and it confused many as to what exactly was going on. A few of the professors, however, that were more knowledgeable figured out what had occurred and had wry smiles. They couldn't exactly say that it was a broom reaching nearly unheard of speeds, as that would cause even more problems. The only reason it was nearly unheard of instead of just plain unheard of was that there was in fact a type of broom created a few decades prior capable of breaking the sound barrier. Speed had never been an issue for broom makers. No, the real problem came in the form of wind pressure and control. At such high speeds it became difficult to have any fine control over the broom, thus relegating that type of broom to cross-continental travel alone. Nick's broom, however, did not have that problem, as his reaction speed was superhuman thanks to the ritual of reflex he went through. This meant that giving the broom hair trigger sensitivity wasn't detrimental like it would be for normal people. Add on the wind resistance protection and Nick was zipping through the sky at stupid fast speeds, having a good old time. There was a couple of people on the Quidditch teams that noticed how easy it was for him to fly at such a speed and became very interested in his broom. It should be known that speed was a very important factor in the game, as it made winning much easier. This actually caused a rather funny scene as they approached Nick after he landed and asked about the broom. He decided to play a small prank on them and didn't explain why he alone was capable of using it and let one of them borrow it for a test flight. Both that person and the broom had to be saved from crashing into the ground at Mach 1. The others didn't believe that it was so difficult to handle despite the person's testimony and tried it out themselves before also needing to be saved from a gruesome end. Nobody showed any interest in the broom after that, as they all valued not dying needless deaths. Nick knew that it wasn't impossible to learn how to fly like that for a normal person, considering fighter pilots did so in considerably larger and more complex machines. The key difference, however, was that it required a lot of training to do, and even then one mistake and that fighter jet will hit the ground, or worse, another plane. Sure, he could probably start his own broom company with his knowledge, but he didn't see much point. Chapter 344, Relaxing Christmas. Time blurred by for Nick after that until he eventually found himself with a pile of presents at the foot of his bed on Christmas Day. He had gifts of all shapes and sizes waiting for him when he woke up and was slightly surprised at the number. There was of course gifts from his friends that numbered 8, since the twins were included in that group. Then there was a gift from Hagrid, Lupin, Sirius, McGonagall, Flitwick, Dumbledore, and even Snape. These gifts also weren't surprising at all to receive for Nick, as he figured he would receive something from them. No, the surprise came from 4 people he had simply not expected to get a gift from at all due to his limited interaction with them. Madame Maxime, Ollivander, Mr. Crumonti, and Nicholas Flamel all sent him gifts. His curiosity got the best of him and he ignored the normal gifts in favor of opening these first. From Madame Maxime there was a card addressed to him that explained why he had received a gift from her. It was simply because she loved the newest line of fashion that had been created based on Nazgul and wanted to give him a piece of it to show her appreciation. Her gift was an open-chested trench coat with long sides and raised collar that was primarily black with cream and gold undertones and seams. On either side of the chest was 2 brilliant and detailed golden eyes with reptilian slit pupils. Despite its intimidating color choice and style, the coat still managed to capture Nazgul's friendliness and positivity. Nick loved it. Ollivander, on the other hand, didn't send a card or anything, but rather a copy of a book on veritology. It was a simply but good gift that showed the value he placed on guiding future craftsmen in the art. From Mr. Crumonti he received a card telling him how much the old man enjoyed having him as a guest when he so rarely received them. The gift was twofold in fact, as it contained a very rare tome on magical crafting as well as a sealed container with the first dish Nick had ordered from the restaurant. The preservative charms were still working perfectly, as when Nick opened the container the food was still hot and fresh as if it was served not moments before. Nicholas Flamel on the other hand sent Nick a book on the basic knowledge he was likely missing from creating his own crafting style. Most of it was things he had already patched after he received the great alchemist's advice previously. But there was several points that were not covered in any texts he had browsed for that, a wonderful gift. From his friends the gifts were much more personal in nature. Harry sent him a feather grooming kit with a tag attached teasing him for his beast companions. Ron sent a small wooden bird that he had secretly carved out of a piece of wood. Hermione sent some of his favorite candy in the form of chocolate frogs of various flavors. Daphne sent him a chunk of star metal with a tag that explained how he had complained about his lack of stock in it. Tracy, much like Hermione, sent chocolate frogs, though of the normal variety this time. Luna sent a copy of the Tales of Beetle the Bard that she bookmarked her favorite stories in. This made him chuckle, as he had long memorized this book of stories to see if it was only the three brothers' tale with some accuracy or if there were others as well. From Hagrid he got a container of the man's walnut fudge, which was practically guaranteed cavities. Flitwick a book on rare metals, McGonagall a fancy new golden inkwell, Snape sent a set of mind-clearing potions, and Dumbledore sent a strange metal box that was positively humming with mana. It was odd since it appeared to be made from 6 different types of material and yet didn't have a single seam anywhere on it. One side was bone, one was iron, one was wood, one was quartz, one was ice, and the last one was skin, all of which were solid without any give. Lupin and Sirius's gifts were more personal in nature, as one of them sent Nick a valuable set of material while the other a thick stack of old books. Lupin sent the materials and Sirius sent the books directly from the Black family library. All in all, Nick would say he had a good morning on this Christmas day. The day was quiet and relaxing as the population of the school got into the festive spirit. Chapter 345, Returning Friends. It wasn't all fun times for Nick though, as he and Nazgul both hit a growth spurt at this point and started to grow. For Nick it was normal growth due to him being 12 and officially hitting puberty. For a human this was a little late, but for an elf it was fairly standard due to their long lifespans allowing for a longer growth period. In Nazgul's case, however, it was because she had eaten quite a few souls from small creatures since the last time she grew and now had enough energy stored to get bigger. She did too, as by the time the holiday break was over she was slightly smaller than a horse in size and simply didn't fit in most parts of the castle anymore. At least not without making those areas a bit crowded. The hallways were large, but even those were only so wide and she took up roughly half of them. Doorways were entirely impossible to fit through for her now, much to her great distress. Nick was unfortunately left with little choice but to either keep her in the realm all the time or have her stay out of the castle entirely. Hitting puberty as an elf did something rather surprising for Nick's mana reserves that he hadn't expected. See, for a while now his mana growth had slowed to a crawl, which was to be expected considering he had way more mana than a 12-year-old had any business with at his disposal. As a result, his growth had slowed down to allow his body to acclimate to the power within it. Hitting puberty, however, had accelerated his growth rate again, though not by as fast as before. Instead he was right beneath Harry's growth. This was much more acceptable than his previous speed considering the threats he had to actively prepare for. Still, on New Year's Day he wasn't thinking about any of that as he stood outside the castle waiting for his friends to arrive. When Nick spotted Hermione and the other girls leaving a carriage, he smiled and waved at them. They all smiled and walked over. "Welcome back," he said happily as they arrived before him. "That book on enchantments was a huge help with my studies over the holidays, thank you, Nick," Hermione said excitedly. "Same here," Daphne added with a smile without losing her composure. "Your gift got me in trouble with my father. He said metalworking is not a thing a proper lady should do. Can you believe that?" Tracy complained, but it was still clear that she actually liked her gift. "Crafting knows no gender and any craftsman worthy of the name will say the same," Nick said reassuringly. "Yet I know, but it still sucks that my father doesn't agree," Tracy said with a sigh. "I take it you also like your gift, Luna," Nick said with a raised eyebrow at the girl who had changed her hair to a rainbow color. "Omu. The rack spurts dance funny around it," she said with a dopey smile. Nick chuckled at that answer. That's just because of how I made it, otherwise it isn't all that special. He said honestly. Maybe not to you, but I like it. Luna said, and Nick smiled. I'm surprised that Harry and Ron aren't with you all. Hopefully they didn't try and take a flying car to school this time. Nick said jokingly. Hermione grimaced at the mention of that incident. Thank Merlin not. We couldn't all fit into a carriage, so they had to get in a different one is all. She explained with an exasperated expression. Ah, speak of the devil, here they are. Nick said as the next carriage stopped and its door opened to reveal Harry and Ron all bundled up to resist the weather. Bloody hell, you wouldn't believe the looks I got from my family when they saw your gift, Nick. Ron complained immediately after the boys joined up with the group. Why, I'd never thought I'd see the day my little Ronnie would be excited to get a book. That's what my mum said when she saw it before she forced me to spill it and tell them about me learning to make wands. It was dreadful. He continued complaining. Looks like a classic case of suffering from success to me. Nick joked and everyone else in the group smirked except Ron. Don't you joke around about this, I never heard the end of it the rest of the holiday and felt like dying in embarrassment. Ron said with a small smirk. How about you, Harry? What did you think of your gift? Nick asked the only person who hadn't spoken yet. It's brilliant. You should have seen how jealous Sirius was when I pulled it out of the sheath. Harry said with a wide smile. Chapter 346, History in the Making. Oh right. Sirius wanted me to thank you for his present, says he was starting to get sick of potions anyways. Harry added and Nick chuckled. I assumed as much. He didn't strike me as the type to enjoy sitting in place for very long even if it was for his own good. He said honestly. Harry nodded. He's great and all, but rather restless after being cooped up for so long to recover. He said with a sigh. He still has nightmares about that place, you know. I've heard him crying in his sleep sometimes. He said softly. Can't say I blame him. From what I know of that cursed place, purposeful starvation and constant exposure to the happiness-eating monsters that are dementors that make you relive your worst memories over and over will take its toll on even the strongest of wills. Nick said with a disgusted expression. Despite considering themselves better than Muggles, the Wizards' version of prison was considerably more inhumane in the Isles than the Muggle prisons. The group got quiet at this, as it was an ugly truth that no one liked looking at. You are in for a treat though when you see Nazgul. She's bigger than before. Nick said, breaking up the gloomy atmosphere. How much bigger? Hermione asked, suspicious of his smirk. Nick didn't answer but merely whistled loudly, which also drew the attention of the other students arriving. From out of the forbidden forest with a giant spider leg sticking out of her mouth flew Nazgul. Please tell me that thing in her mouth isn't what I think it is. Ron said, pale and shuddering at the thought. Okay, I not. Nick teased and everyone other than Ron laughed. There was quite a few oohs and ahs when Nazgul landed on the ground not far from the group. In the time it took her to fly over, she finished eating her snack and had gotten excited after seeing the group. She had developed a taste for the giant spiders in the forest after one of them attacked the young unicorn that was friends with her and she killed it. Nick was fairly certain that she got that food preference from the basilisk that had clear influence on her form before she was born. Still, other than Hagrid, who insisted that she not eat Aragog, the rest of the man-eating spiders were fair game. As much as the half-giant disliked the idea of magical creatures getting hurt, he also understood how predator and prey worked, and Nazgul was clearly the predator of the acromantulas. It was much the same way he would turn a blind eye to a fox killing a rabbit if he came across it. Bloody hell, she's huge! Ron exclaimed when Nazgul walked up. The rest of the group agreed with him as they looked at her in awe. My theory is that by the time she's fully grown she'll be about the size of a dragon and way more dangerous to boot. Nick said while scratching Nazgul under her jaw where she liked it. The large creature's eyes narrowed in enjoyment at his ministrations and swished her tail happily behind her. Luna was the first of the group to get over her new size and come shower the large beast in affection. This helped the rest realize that she was still the same Nazgul as always and come pet her. Things were peaceful for the next week as Nick mostly relaxed while spending most of his time cranking out rings of protection as well as honing his spell casting for the higher years curriculum. This changed on the 8th of January, which was the next full moon, in which he went with Lupin, Dumbledore, and Sirius surprisingly enough to the Shrieking Shack. To reiterate, this is going to look like a horror show, but nobody make any moves to help him or you could make it so much worse," Nick warned sternly. Both Sirius and Dumbledore nodded seriously as they both understood that the road to hell was paved with good intentions. Other than that, there shouldn't be any complications, so no need to be anxious. Nick added reassuringly. "I do wonder what the result of this enchantment of yours will be. You've been rather silent on the matter so far," Dumbledore said curiously. Despite not knowing exactly how the enchantment worked, the old goat had still looked it over and was surprised to see that it was incomplete when taken from Lupin. Nick had to explain this to him, but afterwards Dumbledore was impressed at the enchantment as the way it worked was ingenious. Using an aspect of the curse to cause the changes to be snuck into the curse's foundation was a tricky and interesting idea. Chapter 347, History in the Making, 2. Despite this, Dumbledore was a little bitter since this method of breaking a curse would only work for something like lycanthropy that was powered by an outside source. Most curses instead fed on the magical energy or life force of the victims, making this method useless to deal with them. Out of everyone in the room, though, Lupin was the most nervous as he was the one that needed to deal with the pain soon. He rubbed his thumb over the ring on his finger to try and calm himself, as he had recently gotten into the habit of doing. They remained silent after that as Nick sat down on a chair he conjured to wait while meditating. Once 7:30 rolled around and the influence of the sun was waning to be replaced by the moon's, Lupin clutched his chest tightly and fell over. Nick opened his eyes and watched the beginning of this transformation carefully. He was also holding his wand in case an unforeseen problem happens. All of his simulations in the realm stated that nothing should, but those didn't account for outside factors interfering. Lupin writhed on the ground in agony as his eyes, ears, and nose bled when the veins burst in them. After that, his bones began to crack and reform all over his body alongside his muscles and inner layer of skin. There was only a whistling sound coming from Lupin as he couldn't even scream from the pain he was feeling. The tips of his fingers grew long, sharp Lupin claws while his teeth and facial bones elongated alongside his ears. It was a gruesome display to witness, but Nick knew it was necessary as this was a process of the enchantment overriding the curse's parts. The final step, though, that spoke of the success of this transformation was when the top layer of Lupin's skin tore and fell off, revealing thick light brown hair on his entire body. Hiss! Hugh! The sound of powerful lungs taking in air and releasing it filled the room, while all three of the spectating wizards waited with bated breath for the owner of these breaths to show some sign of awareness. Lupin lifted his right arm and pushed himself up slowly and uneasily until he could get his wolf-like feet under him. It was only at this point that he opened his now dark brown eyes to take a look at himself. As the moon's energy poured into him, Lupin couldn't help but notice that he felt good, yes, good. Not ill or weak or wrong, but good. He was in awe of it all and raised a claw-tipped arm to inspect, and was surprised at the power he felt coursing through him. His senses were sharp, sharper than ever in fact, as he could smell everything, and his hearing picked up a steady heartbeat and two anxious ones. His vision was perfect and even seemed to be made for the darkness, as he saw everything as if the sun was still up. "You still in there, mate?" Sirius asked worriedly, which caused Lupin to look at him and hold up a clawed thumb. Both Dumbledore and Sirius relaxed at that point and sighed in relief before walking over to look at Lupin's new form closer. "Incredible, an addition 2 feet of height from your transformed legs, and unlike your previous transformations you appear to be in extraordinary condition. Not a single piece of discoloration or disproportional feature on your entire body," Dumbledore said after looking him over carefully. "Now that you are done showing off, turn back, it should be easy to do now," Nick said without having gotten up from his chair at all. "What do you mean?" Sirius asked, confused. "I specifically made that enchantment to give him full control over his transformation after he achieved this form, so he should have the ability to shift back to his human form like any other animagus," Nick explained calmly. Sirius looked at Lupin, but the werewolf looked reluctant, and Nick chuckled since he had an idea why. "It's intoxicating, the power and senses you now have access to, that is," he said, and Lupin looked away in embarrassment. "You can have them whenever you want, like any animagus, so change back already," Nick said calmly, and Lupin nodded. He closed his eyes and immediately his body began to shrink and morph back into its human shape. Much like a normal animagus transformation, it was painless and resembled transfiguration spells greatly. Just before he returned to human form, the extra hair all over his body was shed off and fell into a pile at his feet. "And that, gentleman, is history being made," Nick said with a smirk. Chapter 348, Ritual Plans. The other three wizards couldn't help but finding themselves agreeing with Nick's statement, as this couldn't be anything but a historic event. For the first time since lycanthropy reared its ugly head, there was someone who could fully control it as though it were an animagus transformation. Should word about this get out, it would resound throughout the world and cause a huge commotion. Werewolves were generally considered pests or undesirables by wizarding society precisely because of the inability to control themselves after transforming. If that was not the case, however, many seeking power would flock to get infected for the benefits it would give them. There is one tiny side effect you would need to worry about though: longevity. The curse from before lowered your lifespan greatly because of the damage it did to your body per transformation, and this new state instead does precisely the opposite in that it bolsters it considerably. "I would not be surprised to see you in a couple hundred years looking like the actual old man here," Nick said with a chuckle. "If that is true, then it truly does seem as though you have indeed done as you said and turned the curse into a blessing," Dumbledore said with a twinkle in his eyes and smile. Nick excused himself after that, since he had no more reason to stay and he had a mission to collect. No one tried to stop him, as all of them minus Sirius were aware of how busy he was and that what came next did not concern him. Nick went straight for the castle, and despite Filch seeing him, the old keeper of the castle ignored him, as all the staff had been told of Nick's freedom to roam the castle regardless of time. It certainly helped that Nick made a point to stay on the old man's good side with a magical artifact that didn't need flowing magic to use. It was a simple ring that allowed Filch to use a weak form of telekinesis, but was a prized treasure in the squib's eyes. Filch's status as a squib was not very well hidden, as it was one of the reasons the man seemed to hate the students of the school. Without being able to cast magic but still having it made the man bitter from years of jealousy. That was the truth about squibs that Nick had long since figured out thanks to his senses. They were a result of generations of inbreeding and atrophied magic circuits, creating a person with a magical core but no open pathways for the magic to flow. What the ring did was connect directly to Filch's magical core to fuel his use of telekinesis. Thanks to this easy gift on Nick's part, Filch treated him much more politely than other students. Nick went straight to the workshop before going into the realm to accept his rewards for the mission. Nick had completed the first and third objectives of the quest, but the second one was going to be ignored for his own safety. Publicizing that he had not only basically cured Lupin but had also turned the curse into a blessing was a fast way to paint a massive target on his back by every werewolf on the planet. Good or bad, every werewolf on the planet would be after him, and that didn't even include the people who wouldn't want to see werewolves truly empowered in this manner, which is to say a lot of people across the globe. While he was curious about the contents of this book that would have been his reward, he was more than happy avoiding it and the trouble of completing that objective, since the best prize was already his. 3 item tickets manifested in the realm, but he ignored them to focus on the other item that had appeared instead, a Daedra heart. The hearts of Daedra weren't strictly for moving blood through their bodies, but rather were directly tied to their immortal essence. This was why Daedric equipment was considered alive to a degree, as it was in fact alive thanks to the essence of the Daedra trapped within it. Once the equipment was abandoned or destroyed, the essence was released, and that Daedra could then reform in the waters of oblivion. What Nick wanted the heart for, however, wasn't a piece of equipment but rather a sacrifice to empower himself. This was of course part of his plan involving the ritual of nature to be performed this upcoming Beltane that will increase his magical power based on the power of the creature parts he sacrificed. So far he had the eyes of a 1,000-year-old basilisk, the heart of a Daedra, and the heart of an extinct species of dragon from Slytherin's horde, which meant he only needed 3 more parts to have all he needed. Chapter 349, Possible Parts. The ritual specified that he could use parts from no more than 6 creatures, and so he planned to use the best possible ingredients for it. The 3 he currently had were all at minimum XXXXX class dangerous things, with the Daedra heart being a bit iffy in its category. See, the description of the heart didn't say which sort of Daedra it came from, so it was entirely possible it was the heart of a peon-level Daedra. Even then, though, Daedra were pretty much all apex existences due to their near-immortal natures. It was certainly possible to kill a Daedra, but to do so required dispersing their essence entirely, which was difficult to say the least. The problem Nick had at the moment was that there was not any powerful creature parts that he could get his hands on that weren't either highly illegal or kept by old families as treasures. He could use acromantula parts since they were fairly powerful creatures, but the thought seemed wrong to him, cheap almost. With a colony of the things available to be hunted, he could easily obtain what he wanted from them, but he wanted only the best for his ritual. He was briefly tempted by the Hydra heartstring within the staff, but immediately shook that thought from his head as foolishness. The staff was basically the perfect way to resurrect someone or heal a life-threatening injury, so destroying it for the heartstring would be the height of stupidity. Out of all the XXXXX class creatures left in the world, the only one that really caught his attention due to its nature was a lithofold. These creatures were immortal, just like dementors and poltergeists, and much the same, were basically impossible to kill via conventional magics. Lithofolds at first glance appeared to be little more than dark cloak-like objects that were a bit too flowy. In truth, they were dark things that hunted by creeping around their victims when unaware and suffocating them to death before slowly dissolving the body and consuming it. They also exclusively hunted humans, making them contain on-site targets for wizard kind. Apparently the creatures grow more powerful and larger the more they consume, with the largest known lithofold being nearly 20 feet long and needing a team of over 50 powerful wizards to contain it, of which 20 died in the process. Thanks to the soul shot arrows Nick had, he could actually kill the things, but this came with the problem of finding one worth killing. The largest one was contained within a large, nigh impenetrable goblin forged box positively covered in seals within the Ministry of Magic's Forgotten Halls. The Forgotten Halls were not referring to a place that had been forgotten, but rather about the nature of the things stored there. The phrase "lock it, throw away the key and forget it" existed summed up the way the Ministry, and by extension wizarding community, treated things stored here. The Forgotten Halls were the place things were sent to be purposefully lost to history and hopefully never found again. Nick wouldn't have even known about the existence of the place had it not been for the brief mention of it in one of the Forbidden Sections books. Dottie! Nick called out after leaving the realm with the 3-item tickets. With a loud pop, the house elf appeared before him, eager to serve. "How can this one serve the great master?" Dottie asked eagerly. "Find a lithofold and kill it with these before bringing whatever is left afterwards to me, assuming there is anything left," Nick commanded while handing over a dozen soul-shot arrows. The elf took the arrows and vanished, eager to do as he had commanded regardless of how dangerous the task seemed. That was simply the way house elves were, so Nick didn't mind at all and considered the matter of the 4th creature part finished for now. This left him with the last 2 parts needed for the ritual that was rapidly approaching. He sighed before accepting that an acromantula part was going to be the 5th ingredient. If he could freely advertise that he needed rare and powerful creature parts, with the rarer and more powerful the better, then he wouldn't need to do this. The reality of the matter, however, was that any advertisement like that is asking the Ministry to bust down his door and throw him in Azkaban for illegal magic use. As a result, Nick could only resolve himself to getting slightly less than optimal results, as this was the last year he could perform the ritual due to the age restriction on it. Chapter 350, Waiting. Ideally, Nick wanted a part from a North American horned water serpent, but not only were they highly illegal to hunt, but were the house animal of one of the Ilvermorny houses. Considering that was the only magical school in North America being even remotely related to the hunting of the things was a fast way to get on the whole population's bad side. It also didn't help that the huge serpents also had powerful divination abilities that made it impossible to hunt them unless they allow it. At that point, though, it becomes a matter of hoping that whatever they saw in the future was solved by their sacrifice, or you were in for a rough time. That reminded Nick for whatever reason of the magical family that existed over in the United States that was the descendants of Slytherin, the Sayer. It was rather funny in a way that the only remaining members of Slytherin's bloodline in the world had entirely abandoned the man's institution and country. In fact, unlike the Gaunts, the Sayer were very noble, as they truly sought the betterment of wizards, both Muggleborn and pureblood alike. I should probably get to work on that soul-devouring spell for Harry now that he has that dagger suppressing the soul shard. Nick thought offhandedly as he pondered how to get what he needed for the ritual. There was a very long list of magical creatures to choose from, and while most were illegal, there were a few that he might be able to get his hands on in short order. I suppose I need to take a trip to the black market in Nocturn Alley to test my luck, he decided finally before pulling out a textbook to study. He wasn't on a very tight deadline anymore and thus felt it a good idea to focus on increasing his magical skill to the 7th year at minimum as fast as possible. Thankfully he could mostly ignore potions, herbology, history, and transfiguration, since he was either very good at those subjects or they were mostly just memorization subjects. This left him with Dada, charms, astrology, and his extra classes, which in his case is arithmancy, care of magical beasts, and runes. Runes he had mostly covered but was filling in his basic knowledge that he sort of skipped thanks to his ability. Arithmancy and care of magical beasts though were absolute slogs to go through, because one was mind-meltingly complex while the other required a lot of memorization as well as a good affinity for magical creatures. The first topic required time to figure out, while the second required experience, which was also a form of time. Nick was sort of in a hurry to improve those, so those two subjects were mostly on the back burner for the moment. Learning the information in his textbooks on charms and Dada was a matter of memorization, but actually mastering the information was an entirely different matter. It should be understood that the complexity and power of the magics taught in the later years grew with each year. Nick as a result thought that the Wizarding Society was really pathetic, as they accepted a mere surface-level understanding in order to pass with a good grade. As a result of this, once the students left that information behind, they tended to forget it entirely, which means they were all usually failures when they graduated. Thankfully there was enough people graduating that truly understood the information to keep the society afloat, but it was without any doubt slowly and painfully decaying from all the rest, dragging those few down with them. In a manner of speaking, the upcoming turmoil of Grindelwald's recovery of the world might just be the kick in the backside that wizarding kind needed to truly prosper. Many will die undoubtedly in the process, but the final result would be pretty worth it, all things considered. Nick was fairly certain that this was actually the reason none of the really powerful people are doing much to stop the man, save just going through the motions or hiding away. Anyways, Nick was currently up to the middle of the 5th year in terms of understanding the magic in the textbooks. This was actually quite good considering everything he has been busy with since getting his exemption. Thanks to that exemption he actually had much more time to cover the textbooks, so even while splitting his time with other things he has made good progress. He spent the next few days making rings of protection and pushing his skill ever forward while he waited for his house elf to return to him. Chapter 351, Easy Hunt. While he waited for that, he took a few hours to visit the Forbidden Forest with Nazgul to hunt another acromantula. Much to his surprise, the territory of the giant monster spiders had actually shrunk rather than grown. It should be understood that the spiders basically had no natural predators in this forest, and it was only the efforts of the centaurs and unicorns that kept their spread at bay, but only just barely. Acromantulas bred 3 times a year in huge numbers each time, so it did not take much time at all for their numbers to swell to uncontrollable amounts if left without a natural predator. Due to the ever-increasing need for food, this created the spiders started to expand their territory further and further. That is until now it seems as Nazgul is diminishing their numbers rapidly if they have drawn back this much. Nick thought, seeing the clearly abandoned webbing that the centaurs were starting to clear out. These same centaurs obviously saw him, but after seeing Nazgul with him chose to keep whatever rude thoughts they had to themselves. She was a blessing as far as they were concerned and was even friendly with the unicorns of the forest, so Nick couldn't be too bad if he was with her. As Nick traveled deeper into the area that used to belong to the giant spiders, he couldn't help but notice how lifeless it was. The webs that blocked out the sun beyond the treetops had caused all other plants other than moss to die off. This in turn led to the herbivorous creatures and the things that hunted them to vacate the area. Nothing lived in this part of the forest, which showed just how terrible the spiders were. Nick had no trouble seeing in the low-light conditions of this area thanks to his night vision, but for regular diurnal creatures it would be perfect conditions to ambush prey for the stealthy monsters that lived here. Nick and Nazgul spotted one of the acromantulas before it spotted them from its hiding spot behind some roots of a tree. The thing had one of its legs held flat against the ground in front of it as if mimicking a root, but that trick would only work if the prey didn't have night vision like Nick and Nazgul did. To them it was pretty much just advertising its position like an idiot, which they were more than happy to take advantage of. Nick tapped his wand against the ground and immediately a net of chains shot out of the ground and trapped the huge spider. Hiss! The monster struggled violently against its sudden trappings, but Nick merely scoffed at it. The net he conjured was made out of tungsten and not even a dragon had any hope of escaping it, much less this thing. Nazgul wasted no time at all pouncing on the struggling spider and ripping its soul out with his sharp talons. She ate the thing with relish but left the still living body to Nick since its parts were what he was in the forest for to begin with. He didn't need the legs, so he ripped them off and let her eat them while working to collect the venom before it dried, as well as the usable parts of the rest of it. A few other spiders showed up after likely catching the scent of the attack and coming to investigate, but Nick released Nazgul on them. If he had any doubt about how dangerous she was before seeing her hunt, then those doubts were gone now, as she barely needed any real effort to catch or kill the spiders. Petrify them with her stare, and harvesting at her leisure was her preferred method of hunting, but pure brute force was also an option if the spiders didn't make eye contact. Nick shuddered at the memory of her collapsing a spider's carapace under her talon like it was made of dried leaves. Still, he got a hefty amount of venom as well as the part he needed by following her on her hunt, so he was satisfied with how it turned out. Once he returned to the castle, Nick handed over about half the venom to Snape since he would be able to put it to good use. The man had a ghost of a smile on his face after receiving the rare and valuable liquid in such a large amount, as he easily figured out how Nick had obtained it. The colony of spiders living in the woods was a sort of open secret at the school, so he was very much aware of it as well as made use of the spiders as well. Thanks to this, he was intimately familiar with how much venom a single spider gave and could calculate the number needed to harvest the amount he received. Chapter 352, Space Travel. Nick could only postpone his trip to Nocturn Alley for now, as he needed Dottie's help to get there. With that in mind, he finally chose to get to work on the method he chose to fill his need for star metal to make the Atronak forge. The plan was quite simple really, as he was going to modify a broom to reach escape velocity and fly out of the Earth's atmosphere. That was unfortunately the easiest part of the plan. The hard part was that he needed to have a way to survive in the vacuum of space as well as draw the floating debris orbiting the planet towards him to be harvested. He had no intention of even trying to reach the moon, however, despite it logically speaking having rich amounts of star metal from all the meteors that impacted it over its long existence. The reason for this is that the distance is simply too great to get there without teleporting or traveling so fast he would die. Escape velocity is unfortunately the best he could withstand, and returning to Earth is extremely easy, as he merely needed to use a portkaya to be back without any issue at all. He knew for a fact that obtaining a portkaya was actually fairly easy, all things considered, as there were no less than 4 in the room of hidden things. He knew this because spatial magic had a rather unique look to it in his magical senses, and he had studied the portkaya that Ollivander used briefly to get a feel for what they felt like. The only problem Nick had with these port keys was that he had no clue where they led to, and he was rather reluctant to test them. If they led to places in the Isles, then that would be perfect, but he had a sneaking suspicion that this wasn't the case. I should probably just put in a request to the Ministry for a portkaya to Hogsmeade and wait for that, then risk it with these things. Nick decided and turned to look at the strange set of items on the table before him. The first was a full-sized suit of seamless clothes that he had enchanted heavily to protect him from cosmic radiation, the cold and the vacuum of space, which was irritatingly difficult for him. He even had to create a complex choker built into the neck of the clothes that had the ability to store and release breathable air while also covering his head in a tight vacuum-proof bubble that he could see out of. These preparations alone took him nearly a week to finish in total, and that was only because he needed to test them in a true vacuum, which he did by using the realm to subject them to one. Having the realm made tests like this considerably easier than the sort of work that would normally be needed to do so. The final step he needed was the broom, portrait, and method of drawing the scattered star metal to him. The first of which was easy, as he simply made a flying broom out of ebony wood that had 7 bands of silver at different points on the handle. The bristles were made of white oak and had Daedric runes carved on them for stability and spatial movement. The 7 bands of silver dictated the protection the broom got from the vacuum, as well as speed, stability, steering and mana storage. The finished product was a beast of a broom that hit escape velocity both within the atmosphere as well as out of it. Unfortunately, the enchantments that made this possible drained a stupid amount of energy to function, which was why Nick included the equivalent of 2 Dumbledores worth of mana in the battery rings fueling the enchantments. After all, it was quite hard to bring a person up to the right speed to leave the atmosphere entirely. After that, though, it was much easier to move about, as there was little friction to slow or stop you. With this finished, Nick had to work on the thing he needed to draw the star metal to him. It was a series of 7 marbles made of what little star metal he had, and enchanted with a powerful attractive force that only worked on things made of the same material. He played a small trick on the enchantments so that the enchantments only worked on the stuff in space, since it would be rather awkward if he stole all the star metal on the planet. It was a tempting thought, to be sure, but he doubted he could get away with it for very long, as a lot of angry wizards would be trying to figure out what the hell happened. Chapter 353, Coming Together. Nick's plan for these marbles was rather simple really, as he was going to set them in place with a spell so that they orbited the planet without falling, regardless of how heavy they become from collecting the free-floating star metal. After about a month, he theorized that they will have collected most, if not all, of the free-floating metal, at which point he will go and harvest the profits. While it may seem a waste to create the means to travel to space just to only use it a handful of times, Nick knew it was necessary. The Atronak forge required a very large amount of star metal to get started, but once it was made he would profit greatly from it. As for actually exploring the cosmos, Nick knew he was definitely not powerful enough for that, and that the actual preparations for such a thing were much more intense than this. Despite what many thought, magic wasn't some rule-less thing that allowed wizards to bend reality without effort. There were very clear and strict rules when magic did anything at all, and it always demanded a cost to do it. Usually this was mana or life force, but there was no mistaking that there was a cost to all magic. The cost to travel the cosmos effectively would be so astronomical if done in the conventional manner that it wasn't even funny. Merely the cost to travel to the moon and back was so high that Nick had no way at all to pay it safely using that method. Instead, the route Nick wanted to use in the future was spatial magic travel, such as teleportation. For a much smaller cost, a wizard could connect 2 points in space and hop between them regardless of distance in nearly an instant. Looks like I am all set minus the portrait from the ministry, but that should be here soon. Nick thought after testing the spacesuit he made in a vacuum in the realm while he was wearing it. The suit served its function well, as wasn't affected by being in a vacuum at all and still had full range of movement. Returning to the real world after changing out of the suit, Nick was satisfied with how well his plans were starting to come together. He had roughly 3.5 months before Beltane, so he should have all the ingredients he wanted for the ritual at that point. All of his many other plans were also coming together nicely as he took firm strides in each of them. He was especially looking forward to completing the Atronak forge and getting started on his small army of magical servants that will help him greatly come the time when Zeus appears. Since he didn't have an exact date for that event and merely had the vague as hell a few years after Grindelwald reboots the world timeline, he knew that he might need expendable forces to collect information and resources after he went into hiding. Atronaks fit that description to a T, and the best part is, depending on what element they had, they were also immune to Zeus's most famous type of magic, lightning. Storm Atronaks were in fact totally immune to electricity, and in fact it only made them stronger. I imagine that Zeus is in for quite a rude awakening if he tries to smite one of them with a thunderbolt. Nick thought with a smirk. Despite wanting to complete these projects as fast as possible, Nick was forced to delay their finishes by factors outside his control. In this case he was waiting for the ministry to send his portkaya and for Dottie to finish hunting a lithofold. He wasn't concerned about the time it was taking his house elf to accomplish this task, as the creatures were very hard to track down since they had few environmental factors as far as habitat was concerned. The only one known for sure was that they tended to inhabit tropical climates and were always near humans. Obviously that didn't exactly narrow the search down a whole lot, considering how many people were spread out in places with tropical climates. As for the ministry's part in his plan for collecting star metal, it was merely the usual slow grind of bureaucracy holding up progress. With nothing pressing him for his attention, Nick finally reopened the doors of the workshop to his friends to hang out in for now. "How I've missed this place," Ron said while lovingly stroking the woodworking equipment he hasn't been able to use for nearly a month. Tracy was not much different with the metalworking equipment, but the rest were much better since their training didn't need the stuff. Chapter 354, Strange Remains. "Stop being dramatic, I made sure you had equipment for your own crafts before I closed off the workshop," Nick said, rolling his eyes. "It's not the same, yours are so much better." Ron whined and Tracy nodded vigorously in agreement. "Of course they are. Do you know how much money and time I've spent just ensuring the quality of my equipment?" Nick asked rhetorically. "I was kind enough giving you what I did to work with it all, so if you want better get it yourself," Nick said sternly. "What about us?" Luna asked with a slightly tilted head. "You and Harry don't even use equipment at all," Nick said with an exasperated sigh. "That reminds me, but what have you been doing this whole time anyways?" Daphne asked, and the rest also looked interested to know. "Several things actually, but mostly taking care of some of my more immediate concerns, like helping Professor Lupin with an important issue and moving some things forward," Nick said casually while sitting down on his usual chair. "What could the professor need help from you for?" Hermione asked with a confused expression. Nick shrugged. "You'll have to ask him yourself since it's not my place to say," he said honestly. She seemed frustrated at this answer but understood that it was likely a personal subject for Lupin and chose to leave it alone. It helped that everyone was aware that trying to press Nick for information he didn't want to give was really hard. He was very stubborn about keeping pieces of important information to himself when he spoke. All of his friends had gotten used to his constant use of half-truths or vague answers by now and knew better than to try and get more from him. It was at this point that Dottie showed up in the workshop with a loud pop, startling everyone there. Nick recovered first, however, and immediately locked his gaze on the thing held in the house elf's left hand. It was a dimly glowing gem that was black in color and seemed to have a nebulous swirl of dirty gray energy within it. "Is that the remains?" he asked calmly. Dottie wasted no time handing the gem over to Nick and answering, "Yes, master, the arrows you gave me worked flawlessly to dispatch the foul creature," the house elf said with a shudder. Nick noticed this and could easily figure out that the death of the lithofold was likely an unpleasant experience for Dottie. "Good work, Dottie. Rest up for a couple days and I'll call you again for help soon," Nick said with a pleased smile and some praise, which was like stimulant for the house elf. As a species, house elves lived to serve, and so praise made them beyond happy when they got it. Dottie vanished from the room before Ron piped up. "Did anyone else notice that house elf was wearing fine clothes?" he asked, clearly doubting his eyes. "I think we all did, but I am more interested in what that stone is he's holding," Daphne said while pointing at the small gem in Nick's hand. "This is just the remains of a lithofold, nothing that interesting," Nick said casually while placing the gem into the realm to be analyzed. "Aren't those Amortal?" Hermione asked with a confused expression. "Indeed they are, but I figured out how to kill evil Amortal creatures like that and sent my servant to dispatch one of the things so I could obtain its remains," Nick explained, since the information was bound to become common soon enough. "What sort of magic did you use? Can I learn it too?" Hermione asked a couple questions eagerly, but Nick held up a hand to stop her. "First is that it is a magic that came from me personally. Second, I have no intention of sharing it at this time, since not even I know the full potential it holds, and it's very rough around the edges," he explained, and the girl deflated unhappily. Forget all that. What's this immortal business she mentioned? Is that like immortality? Ron asked, clearly stuck on that idea. It's not talked about all that much, but basically there is roughly 4 states of existence that a creature could fit into. Mortal is of course well understood by everyone, so I won't talk about that. Immortal is also understood by everyone fairly well, so I also won't speak on that either. The final 2, however, is where things get interesting, as they are hard to fully understand. There is partial immortality, in which one simply won't die unless certain conditions are met first. These conditions could be any number of things, so we would never leave if I had to explain the intricate parts of this. The final form, however, is immortality, which cannot die in normal cases as it was never alive to begin with. Dementors, poltergeists and Lethifold fall into these categories. Nick explained calmly. Chapter 355, Noseless Thoughts. POV Voldemort. I was confused more and more the deeper I dug into the Ravenclaw brat's history and background, as it didn't seem to make any sense at all. First, the boy seemed to appear out of nowhere with heavy injuries and amnesia, and none of the Muggles thought to get him medical attention beyond a call-in doctor. This was the first strangeness he found about the boy, but definitely not the last by any stretch of the imagination. The one that made the least amount of sense to me, though, was that when the boy showed his exceptional talent, not one Muggle found it odd at all. It didn't make any sense at all, so I immediately jumped to magic as the cause, but none of the Muggles had even a single whiff of magical influence on them at all, despite giving them close inspection. It frustrated me to no end how elusive any deeper understanding of this mere child avoided me. In the end, after failing to get anywhere after searching every known avenue of history that the boy had not in the wizarding world, I could only shelve the matter for the moment. Once I did that, I finally turned my attention to the state of my forces and frowned in displeasure at what I found. Many of my followers had played a few small tricks to avoid getting sent to Azkaban once I fell, but had failed to seek me out in all this time or hold sway over the Isles. It was disappointing to say the least, as I had assumed many would have at least held my reign over the Isle steady in my absence for a few years, but they had folded without hesitation. I was most displeased with this, but knowing they were facing that old man, I could understand their actions. Dumbledore was no base foe that could be avoided for long without a power equal to his to confront him with. None of my servants had such power, which I admit may have been my own doing to some degree. I was loath to share my hard-earned knowledge with the fools that lacked the drive to improve. Severus, my trusted spy, was different than all the others, as he too was half-blooded such as myself and strived for greatness. Bellatrix and Barty Crouch Jr. were also worthy to be my most faithful followers, as they strove to please me and bring my grand vision to life without losing faith even after my fall. Alas, only Bellatrix remained alive, as Azkaban claimed Barty suspiciously fast for a man of such potent will, which made me think he may have been purposefully killed. I had long decided that I needed to rescue my followers from that prison, but the time was not right yet, and the Dementors were proving difficult to sway. This didn't surprise me, since they weren't very smart creatures to begin with and were content to eat the happiness of the prisoners in Azkaban. Still, like any population set on a limited ration diet, there were a few individuals that were dissatisfied with the fact they were not allowed to feast freely. These few individuals were easy to convince to serve me, and through them I was slowly extending my grasp over the entire population. That reminded of an annoying fact I was recently made aware of that proved to be headache-inducing from how concerning it was. Apparently the brat created a new form of magical crafting that had the power to erase my own dark marks. Severus had tried to study this new subject and unfortunately suffered the loss of his mark as a result. Rather than give him a new one as he asked, I instead branded the mark upon an item that he could hide from the old man, unlike the mark. This allowed him to serve even better at spying on the foolish headmaster as well as the brat. Still, the brat was growing more and more troublesome the longer he was left alone, and needed to be slowed down before I can no longer easily dispatch him. Normally the thought that a mere child could cause me any sort of trouble would be insulting at best, but that was unfortunately the truth. I am not foolish enough to dismiss a potential problem after it has repeatedly caused me trouble already, after all. The problem I had was that unfortunately the boy didn't have many openings by which I could attack easily without revealing myself to the world. The few weaknesses that he did have were all very well protected without a single exception, which led me to having to use the muggles he's interacted with as bait. Chapter 356, Nocturn Alley. Nick had spent the last 2 days analyzing the remains of the Lethifold to hopefully figure out how the creatures operated. Even with the realm's help, this proved horrible complicated, as many of the answers he got were paradoxical in nature and made little sense at all. See, the realm's analysis said that the energy in the gem both existed and did not at the same time, while simultaneously being both alive and dead as well. Nick was confused to say the least, because he couldn't figure out how any of that worked without creating a singularity. Singularities were a theoretical magical phenomena that were created by true paradoxes, such as going back in time and killing your previous self. In theory, if you did this, then you simultaneously failed to do this as well, because you couldn't go back in time to kill your previous self if you were already dead before you did so. This never-ending cycle of succeeding and failing at the same time is a theoretical singularity. According to the realm, this gem is a singularity into itself that is somehow tied to the world and thus existed in it while also not at the same time. Needless to say, even thinking about it gave Nick a headache, so he dropped any hope of understanding it for now. Waking up on Saturday, he got dressed in some casual wizarding clothes before speaking Dottie. He called out, and with a loud pop, the house elf appeared in the common room. "Take me to Diagon Alley," he commanded, and his servant eagerly moved to fulfill his will. Nick got more than a few strange looks when he first arrived in the densely populated and active alley, but he ignored them. He entered a true alley between 2 buildings and conjured up a full-length mirror from a wall. Once he could see his full body, he tapped his wand against his chest and slowly and methodically worked to transfigure his own body into an adult form. Human transfiguration was a complex and difficult process even on someone else, but using it on oneself was even more so. Still, Nick merely needed a little more effort than normal to pull it off. When he was done, he stood at 6 feet 2 inches and had a narrow but toned body that was covered in plain black robes. For his face, he simply changed his eye color to blue and adjusted his features to be larger and more narrow, giving himself a shifty look. His hair was removed entirely for this transfiguration, and he even went so far as to add scars to his face. All in all, he looked like he belonged in Nocturn Alley, so he figured no one should bat an eye at him. Walking out of the alley, Nick joined the flow of foot traffic until he reached the entrance to the notorious alley, at which point he walked into it. There was an almost immediate shift in the tone and feel of his surroundings, as if he had walked into a dungeon all of a sudden. He knew what it was from too, as his magical senses picked up the intense dark powers of the various cursed or evil objects within the stores and houses that lined the sides of Nocturn Alley. This wasn't to say that there weren't normal or positive magical signatures as well, but the number of the dark ones far outnumbered those. The people in the alley also had fearful or predatory gazes about them that showed Nick that he needed to stay on his toes. "You are a new face in these parts, so you must not know that there is a toll to pass through this area." "Nothing major, only a mere 12 galleons." A man with dirty hair and many broken teeth said with a greedy smile. Nick merely pointed at the man with his left hand, and a gout of flames leapt from his fingers and consumed the man before he could even scream, leaving not even ashes behind. Those watching this from nearby, hoping for a good show, immediately turned away and acted as if nothing happened fearfully. No one thought about getting the Aurors involved at all, as scenes like this weren't uncommon and no sane Auror would willingly come to this place. Nick coldly continued walking, as he had made his stance on moving against him clear. Had the man not reeked of foul magic and blood, Nick might have hesitated to kill him, but he did, so there was no reason to have mercy. Despite that, though, he felt disgusted by the thought of killing and held on to that feeling, knowing that it was all that stopped him from taking the last step into evil wizarding territory. Chapter 357, Interesting Pickpocket. Every person he killed is a unique thing within the world that will never return to it, and that was valuable. Once that loses value, then nearly everything does as well, and you start to slip into the cold ways of evil wizards. It may not be immediate and may even take quite some time, but eventually the how you obtain favorable results will start to matter less than the results themselves. It was one of the reasons Nick disliked Dumbledore so much, as he was starting to care less about the how compared to the end results. This was how his for the greater good mindset worked, and was unpleasant to say the least. Anyways, Nocturn Alley was a dark and dreary place with poorly maintained buildings that had various discolorations of their outside walls and rust on their metal signs. Contrary to what the books would have one believe, Borgin and Burke's was not the biggest or most eye-catching store in the alley. The truth was that it was merely the largest store that was near the entrance/exit of Nocturn Alley. Nick didn't enter that particular store as he only felt a single interesting magical item in the store, and it wasn't a creature part. It should be understood like moving about with a transfigured body was uncomfortable to say the least, so Nick wanted nothing more than to complete his business in this place as fast as possible. While he walked deeper into the alley, he felt someone approaching him from behind from his right side with their left hand stiff in front of them. A pickpocket, hey, let's give him a bit of a scare. Nick thought and casually tapped the tip of his wand on his robe the moment the person bumped into him. Oh, sorry Abu. What the hell? The hooded man started before panicking when he realized he couldn't take his hand out of Nick's pocket, which was also empty by the way. Nick wasn't planning on killing the thief, however, as he had no magical taint from dark magic and thus likely wasn't that bad of a person. This was quite the accomplishment for someone in Nocturn Alley. Now what would a person that has never used dark magic be doing within this place? Nick asked calmly while ignoring the man's repeated attempts to escape from his transfigured pocket. What does it matter, you'll just kill me either way. The thief said bitterly once he figured out that it was impossible to escape. Nick smirked. How's about you and I make a deal? The terms are simple, you satisfy my curiosity and in exchange I will let you go without any injuries or messy surprises. Interested? He asked like a demon making a tempting offer. How do I know you will honor your end of the deal? The man asked suspiciously. Nick's smirk grew wider. You don't exactly have much choice but to take my word for it, do you? He asked with a chuckle. The man ground his teeth angrily for a moment before speaking again. Fine. What do you want to know? He asked in defeat. First answer my original question, then we will go from there. Nick said calmly. I am a Muggle-born wizard, so when I received my Hogwarts letter my parents and I were rather surprised. I am not all that talented at magic if I'm being honest, barely average in fact. Anyways, I was fascinated with magic despite this, and after graduating I spent the next 5 years traveling around the world to see all the different magics of the world. He paused for a moment. Nick knew the plot twist must be coming up thanks to this pause, as people tend to only stop when they need a moment to collect themselves mid-speech. Anyways, about a year ago I met what I thought was a wonderful woman that took my breath away in more than one way, it turned out. In hindsight I should have known there was something wrong with the situation when she actually showed interest in me despite me not being very attractive. As it turned out, that woman was a vampire belonging to one of the clans that operated in Sweden and turned me in my sleep after I slept with her. Ever since then I have needed to turn to thievery just to afford the cost of blood in order to survive. The man finally finished his story and Nick actually pitied the poor guy. Vampires were cursed beings that while unaging pay a heavy price for it. First they must drink magical blood to sustain themselves, which without hunting is obviously very pricey. Second is the agony they have upon any sunlight touching their skin, which explained why the man was so well covered. Chapter 358, Vampire Assistant. The final and frankly largest downside to the condition, however, came in the form of them losing nearly all access to conventional magic after they are turned. It isn't so much as it cut the connection between them as the mana in their bodies stop flowing through their circuits, but rather now saturate their blood itself. Without using one's magical circuits it was very hard to use normal magic, thus the general inability to perform magic in the vampire population. The nature of the magical change wasn't very dramatic, all things considered, so Nick hadn't actually noticed that the man was a vampire until now. In fact, the change was so minute that his casual glance at the man's magic with his senses hadn't even registered it. Vampirism wasn't all bad news though, as there were in fact several perks to the condition. First was of course how you stop aging at all and thus can in theory live forever. The second was that the physical abilities of vampires were very much superhuman, whether it be senses, strength, reflexes, or healing. The final perk was that thanks to their magic flowing through their blood, vampires had access to a unique form of magic known as blood magic. Blood magic was frankly speaking broken on so many different levels that it wasn't even funny. Depending on age, diet, practice, and a few other factors, each vampire's blood magic was different and unique to themselves. I only have a few more questions before you are free to go, and I may even have an offer for you depending on your answers. Nick said calmly, which caught the man off guard. First is if you have ever killed anyone to satisfy your hunger. Nick asked simply. What? No, why would I ever do something like that when buying blood works fine? The man got upset at the question. Nick nodded before asking his next question. How familiar are you with crafting, specifically enchanting, and smithing? He asked calmly. Not very, I suppose, like I took ancient runes in Hogwarts but I barely passed it. The man answered with clear confusion. If you were given a chance at a fairly normal life and even great power in exchange for servitude, would you take it? Nick asked seriously. The man was astonished at the question but sank into thought about it for an entire minute. Define servitude. He eventually said suspiciously. If you are told to jump, you ask how high and are not allowed to ignore any order that is within reason. But are otherwise free to do as you wish. Nick said seriously while staring the man down. If that's the case, I'd say it sounds like a damned good deal. So what's the catch exactly? The man asked suspiciously. The catch is that you will serve for a very long time, if not indefinitely. Nick said, making sure to emphasize the word very so the man got the idea. Are you some sort of vampire yourself or something? The man asked, suspicious and on guard. Or something would be correct, so interested in taking that deal. Nick asked while releasing the transfiguration on his pocket, letting the man go. You'll need to give me a few days to get my matters in order, but if it means a shot at normalcy, then you've got yourself a deal. Name's Lucas, by the way. The man said while holding out his hand for a handshake. Nick took the handshake. Nicholas. When you are ready, head over to Diagon Alley and send a letter to Phileas Flitwick at Hogwarts that asked him to get in touch with the ringmaker, he'll understand. He said seriously before handing over 50 galleons to the man. Probably don't need to say it, but if you get any funny ideas about this money besides keeping yourself fed and sending that letter, I will track you down and you won't like how that will go, am I clear? He asked while pressuring the man with his mana and spiritual energy. Crystal. The man says while shivering in fear under the tyrannical power flared up at him. Good, off you go then. Nick said as he fully retracted his power just as fast as he released it. The man fled the area immediately, but Nick ignored his hurry. It's a good thing that this place is mostly abandoned at the moment, or that whole event would have been seen by others. Still, I needed a good assistant for my long-term plans, and who better than a vampire that will live just as long as I do? Nick thought before walking away in a pleased mood. Chapter 359, Black Market. Nick didn't make any detours as he walked and soon reached his destination in the form of a small run-down-looking shack hidden between two houses. If you didn't know any better, then you might assume that this was merely a shed for storing things outside your house. Nick found out about this place thanks to Hagrid not being able to keep his mouth shut if plied with good booze and in good company. It might be a cheap trick, but it worked well, so Nick wasn't above using it to get what he needed. Opening the door to the shack, Nick saw the thick layer of dust and cobwebs that covered the otherwise empty build and ignored them to walk to the back wall and pulled on a rusty nail sticking out. The back wall swung open, revealing a hidden location where the black market was truly found. There was actually two black markets in Nocturn Alley, this one that sold the rarest and most heavily illegal of things, and the open one at the end of the alley that only sold the petty illegal items that the Ministry couldn't care less about. The later of which was prone to getting raided by the Aurors as a show of might that the Ministry used to look good. The true black market was a lively place filled with all sorts of smells, sights, and had a sort of low din from everyone talking to each other alongside the illegal creatures in the market. The sentry that was posted at the entrance to look for Aurors took one look at Nick before ignoring him, as he clearly was not. Nick walked slowly through the aisle that was lined with stalls on both sides selling all sorts of things. It was no surprise to Nick to see several places selling the magical parts from rare or endangered species. He was rather picky however and ignored most of this stuff in hopes of finding something really good. Thanks to his system he didn't need to be worried about someone here falsely labeling their goods as he could see the true descriptions of them. He had quite the lucky break when he was reaching the end of the market as a description appeared that caught his immediate attention. The item was a very old glass jar with preservative fluid in it that had a single egg floating within it labeled horned serpent egg from Greece. Hydra egg, dead a hydra egg recovered from an ancient Greek wizard's tomb by grave robbers and mistaken for a horned water serpent egg. The embryo has long since run out of vitality and died but has otherwise been preserved thanks to the special potion it is stored in. 45 for that egg. Nick said calmly to the merchant that was hidden behind a foggy visage illusion. 65 the merchant said under a voice-changing spell. 50 Nick countered. 60 the merchant said calmly. 55 Nick spoke firmly and the merchant remained silent for a moment before agreeing. Nick took out the agreed-upon sum of galleons and set them down on the stall's counter and after being counted the merchant waved their hand at which point Nick picked up the jar and stored it away in the realm. No more words were exchanged between them as Nick turned and left the stall immediately. With his objective complete Nick slowly browsed through the items being sold in the market but besides an ancient book written in a lost language he didn't find anything worth his time or money. He left the black market at this point and made his way out of Nocturn Alley as well. Once back in Diagon Alley he found a hidden place before releasing his transfiguration returning him to his normal form. Dottie! He called and his ever-faithful house elf appeared. Take me back to Hogwarts. Nick commanded and like that his trip to Nocturn Alley was officially over with. Meanwhile back at the black market someone else was not having a very good time as the thing they had been saving money for suddenly got sold to another person. If Nick was still there he would be surprised to see that it was the woman who had a familiar bond with a genuine horned water serpent from the pageant. Damn it! These last few weeks have been such a pain in the ass. First I just had to run into him of all people in the pageant that he won because of whatever the hells that creature was. Then to top it all off the ancient Hydra egg I was going to use to help my sweet steer evolve had been snatched the very day I could afford it, the woman was complaining to herself. Chapter 360, Space. Nick was obviously unaware of all of this of course but even if he knew he wouldn't have done anything different. He spent the next few days relaxing in between his enchantments of the rings of protection that had more than doubled per day. That was if he focused all of his time on the things though which he was not but he maintained his daily output of 240 rings. At 10 points a pop Nick was rapidly racking up points that he was saving for a rainy day. To be more specific he was waiting until he absolutely needed to use them in order to make sure he didn't find himself in the awkward position of needing something and being unable to get it. During this time Ron had made a request for Nick to make him a ring that copied books and imprinted the knowledge into his head so that he didn't need to study anymore. Do you think that if I could do something like that I would need to study myself? Of course not. Each of my enchantments are rigid in structure and only perform in roughly the way I design them to, not to mention complex enchantments like the sort you are asking for are beyond me at the moment. Nick explained irritated. Look, the fact is that as much as I would like to craft lovely little shortcuts like that I can't because of the limitations I am under. Believe me, I had thought about doing exactly that multiple times but learning and memory are extremely complex subjects so I can't just add a quick smarts enchantment to things without possibly causing the person using it to melt their brain. Nick vented his grievances about the matter freely. This wasn't to say he didn't still love his crafting style, merely that he was frustrated by the limitations it had on it. Nick got over that brief bout of irritation quickly though and got back to relaxing. At the end of this period he finally received the porte-clés from the ministry in the form of an old torn-up looking glove. Looks like it's time to head into orbit and set up my collectors, he thought after testing the porte-clés. While it was unlikely, there always existed a small possibility that someone would mess with his order and have him sent to a dangerous area instead of Hogsmeade. He snuck out of the castle the next day and into the Forbidden Forest under the disillusionment charm. He did this because he didn't want Dumbledore to know about his trip out of the world that would definitely bring questions he didn't want to answer. Creating new magical creatures was strictly illegal, and doing it on accident, such as with Nazgul, versus intentionally with the Atronak Forge, were very different things. The forge was originally only going to operate on his island, but now that he had the realm, he was going to use it there instead. Putting on the spacesuit he made previously, Nick took out the special broom he made and mounted it. Very slowly he eased it out of the tops of the trees of the forest before nervously taking a deep breath and shooting straight up on the broom. Even with the air resistance enchantments, it took every ounce of Nick's strength to hold onto the broom as he rapidly gained altitude. An hour. It took him an entire hour to fully breach the Earth's gravity and finally hit orbit. The spells on the suit worked automatically and he had air to breathe while the vacuum around him was kept at bay. He didn't stop, however, as he rose higher and higher until he finally hit the area around the planet that things tended to float and orbit the planet. He wasn't surprised to find that he couldn't see any of these floating things from here, as compared to the size of the planet they were tiny. He was mesmerized by the view though, as it was hard to describe just how beautiful it was to see the Earth from such an angle. After admiring the view for 10 minutes and literally watching the world turn slowly, he got to work setting his collectors in place. He didn't just toss them out haphazardly though, but rather placed one before flying a long distance away with his broom and placing another one. He did this until he had all 7 set in a peculiar orbit like the electrons of an atom. With those circling the globe like this, they should collect the majority of the star metal near the planet within a month, at which point I will be back up here to collect my spoils, he thought before activating the Portkaya and vanishing from space. Chapter 361, Hostage Situation. Nick failed to take something in mind when he used the Portkaya, however, that made his appearance in Hogsmeade very loud. See, when a wizard or other creature apparate, the loud pop that is heard comes from the air getting displaced as they take off and land. Since port keys operate on roughly the same principle, the surroundings are affected by the travel based on what they were. This meant that when Nick used the port key in the vacuum of space, a piece of that vacuum came with him. The moment he landed in Hogsmeade, the air was pushed out of that spot before being sucked in because of the vacuum filling itself. The sudden conflicting pressure caused the pop to get much louder than normal, drawing attention to him. Nick immediately cast disillusionment on himself, seeing this while cursing himself mentally for not realizing that it would have happened. Thankfully, the dozen or so people that saw him in his spacesuit only caught a brief glance before he vanished. He was sure that they wouldn't be able to make out any meaningful details in that tiny time frame and quickly fled to Hogwarts. He was correct, of course, that no one learned about what exactly it was that they saw, but he would soon have a different headache to deal with. Nick had already changed his clothes before he got back to the school, so no one found anything off about him. Disillusionment may work on the average population of wizards, but Nick wasn't stupid enough to not know that the staff at the school would be able to see past it easily. Much to his surprise, however, he was found by McGonagall almost immediately and told that he needed to speak to Dumbledore on a grave matter immediately. What could have happened in such a short period of time? He wondered in confusion, as from what he could tell there shouldn't have been any events that would require his presence in a mere few hours. He was wrong. Once he got into the headmaster's office, he was surprised to see 3 Aurors standing there with serious expressions. Dumbledore noticed his entry immediately. "Mr. Ravenclaw is here now, so one of you should inform him as to why his presence is required," the old man said seriously, and a blonde-haired male Auror walked over to Nick. "There is a situation going on at the moment by which a group of Muggles has been taken hostage. The criminal is unidentified but has already put forward their demands, namely the turning over of one Nicholas Ravenclaw, unarmed and restrained," the Auror explained sternly. Nick's expression underwent a series of changes in a short period of time, from shock to disbelief and finally settling on cold fury. "Where are they located and who exactly are the hostages in question?" he asked neutrally while clamping down on his emotions using occlumency. "A field in Little Hangleton, and according to what we have discovered, every Muggle you had contact with before receiving your Hogwarts letter," another Auror with brown hair said helplessly. "So the kidnappers chose a spot that prevents ambush and tried to take hostages I may consider trading myself for. This is not the sort of thing someone familiar with me would attempt, as they would know that while it would pain me to do so, I would abandon the Muggles since I am more valuable than them." Nick thought and started going through as many possible identities of people that would try something like this. This must be the work of that noseless bastard, he said once he figured it out. Frankly speaking, the list of people he has offended to the point of such an action or had motive to do this could be counted on one hand, and half that number was dead or imprisoned. As a result, it was easy to deduce that this was Voldemort's idea, as the man had a serious grudge and so little information on him that only he would make such a stupid move. Dumbledore's eyes widened when he heard what Nick said, while the Aurors were all sharing a confused look. "Who are you referring to exactly?" the blonde Auror asked curiously. Nick shook his head. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Give me a few days to think it over," he said seriously. "We were given a week to hand you over as of this morning, so that is all we can afford you, I'm afraid," the Auror said apologetically. "That will be more than enough," Nick said ominously before leaving the office to prepare to dispose of a problem once and for all. Chapter 362, Voldemort's Final Show. Nick had chosen to ignore Voldemort after destroying all the item Horcruxes, since no matter what, the man was doomed to stagnation after losing so much of his soul permanently. His return merely meant that he might make a nuisance of himself a bit earlier than in canon in Nick's opinion, but obviously he was wrong. Add on his purifying and evil-destroying soul-shot arrows and the man was hardly even much of an irritation, since he was easy to kill. As a result, Nick frankly didn't care about him after giving Harry the sunlight dagger that was suppressing the soul shard within his forehead. After this stunt though, that guy needs to go for good, Nick thought as he went into the workshop and turned on the furnace. He grabbed a bar of dragon steel and tossed it into the furnace to melt while he transfigured a mold in the shape of a thin chain. Once the metal was melted, he waved his wand to extract it from the furnace cleanly and flow into the mold. His plan for dealing with Voldemort was quite simple really. First was that he needed to get past the man's caution by truly stripping himself of all magical items. Voldemort was definitely aware of the tricky nature of Nick's enchantment method and thus had definitely had the unarmed stipulation applied to the rings on him. What he didn't know, however, was that the ring that held Nick's realm was literally impossible to keep separated from him, as he could summon it from wherever it may be. Such was the nature of a realm that its owner was unable to ever be truly separated from it while their soul still existed. Weak though it may currently be, Nick's realm was no different. After Voldemort's subordinate captures him, Nick planned to summon his ring and drag Voldemort into it, as the arrogant prick was likely to try and gloat about his victory. Once inside the realm, the fate of the flawed lich was sealed, as Nick had access to everything within it that he will store beforehand. This included his wand, the many soul-shot arrows, all his protective items, and finally this chain he was forging. This chain will work to delay Voldemort long enough for the soul-shot arrows to strike true. The way it will accomplish this is thanks to the individual rings that make up the chain being enchanted to block mana flow with those in contact with it. By linking each of these small weak enchantments of the same kind together, Nick theorized that this should make the resulting effect just barely strong enough to seal Voldemort's mana flow for a few moments, but definitely no longer than 10 seconds. He was helpless about this matter, as at the moment he simply lacked the required power to forge a true Archmage-level magical artifact in one go, and stable enchantments can't be built upon with the Celebrimbor style. In truth, this chain was the highest level of magical artifact he was capable of at the moment, that didn't require time or effect to grow to that point. The anklet of rings on his leg was currently the most powerful artifact he had on hand, as it had been storing energy with each step he took since he put it on last year. Even then it barely reached Archmage levels of power, which is to say it would be irresistible by anything not on that level, and Archmages would struggle to resist its effects. The reason Nick wanted a few days was not to prepare, as he was pretty much set on this matter already, but rather to get Lucas situated on Ravenclaw Island in the manor. Thankfully he could take care of the peculiar needs of his newest servant easily, as he simply needed to put the magical blood fountain enchantment using Daedric runes to good use with a little tweaking. He wanted to change the enchantment to cause the blood to only be created from the mana when the container was empty, while also making sure the blood was the best quality possible for a vampire, which meant it needed to be dragon blood. This as an added downside, however, meant that Nick needed to incorporate a mimicry enchantment that caused the blood created to all be whatever blood the enchantment was exposed to previously, in this case dragon's blood. Tweaking the enchantment was what truly took Nick these next few days, as he set the enchantment on a ring that he placed into a drinking flask along with a drop of Norwegian Ridgeback blood to get the enchantment started. Chapter 363, Voldemort's Final Show, 2. Since the enchantment was made using only Daedric runes rather than using the Celebrimbor style of enchantment, Nick needed to carefully carve out each and every rune with the correct intent and position. This took him about 2 days, since he wanted to get it in a single go rather than make small mistakes and rush it. Still, he finished it up, and just in time too, as that same day Flitwick approached him about a strange letter he had received. Nick thanked him for the dealing with the inconvenience and summoned Dottie right away so that they could go and retrieve Lucas. The vampire in question was hanging around the entrance to Nocturn Alley nervously after sending that letter. He found it a bit odd that the clearly powerful man that he had met previously would need to go through a professor at Hogwarts to get a letter, but could only shrug it off as the eccentricities of a powerful wizard. In truth, Nick only had Lucas go through such a roundabout method so that his name wouldn't accidentally slip if someone asked where he was going after getting his affairs in order. Nick simply didn't want to deal with the irritation of fending off people seeking to hug his thigh with bad intentions. As the only known living Ravenclaw and well-known genius, Nick was a power to be reckoned with both politically as well as economically. He was well aware of this and had as a result been very careful not to get caught doing something that might sully his reputation. The biggest downside to his family name, though, came in the form of those who thought they could trick him due to his young age and thus use the Ravenclaw's power for their own use. That was the great thing about taking Lucas under his wing in Nick's opinion, as not only was the man unaging like himself, but he was totally unaware of who he was actually working for at the moment, so his intentions were not suspect. Nick of course transfigured himself into his previous disguise before he showed up to grab Lucas. The man practically had his jaw hit the floor after Nick brought him to Ravenclaw Island and he saw the various magical beasts living there almost undisturbed and even almost passed out when the ancient manticore named Saram showed up. After getting Lucas settled into the manor with the special flask that the man looked at like a treasure after taking a swig of its contents, Nick went back to Hogwarts to set his plan in motion. The Aurors had been rotated over the last few days, so it was a different group in the school when Nick went to go find them. He was going to make a suggestion on how to get the hostages back safely, but after learning that Dumbledore was going to personally see to the exchange of people, he held his tongue. Regardless of what Nick might think of the man as a person, he would never deny his power and skill. Nick stored all of his personal effects in the realm before leaving the ring behind in Dumbledore's hands with a wink to let the old man know he had a plan. The field where the exchange was set to take place was completely flat and wide with knee-high yellow grass that made any shift from invisible forces visible. All in all, Nick had to admit that it was a perfect place to trade people for a wizard, as unless the Ministry suddenly decided to use a Muggle sniper rifle, the person could easily react to any attack that came their way. When the group appeared at the edge of the field, Nick took the time to sense the magic of the person holding the hostages, but was surprised to find that not only were they not cold or angry at him, but rather seemed almost respectful instead. None of this mattered to Nick so much as the horrible taint that their magic held that was totally inhuman by this point. This mysterious black-cloaked individual had clearly used hideous and vile magics to gain power nearly equal to that of Snape's. The hostage exchange went smoothly with Dumbledore there, and with a loud pop, Nick was forcefully operated away by the cloaked individual while his hands were tied behind him. Having experienced the method of travel before, Nick didn't stumble much after they landed and was alert to his surrounding. It was a cold and musty room clearly located inside a building and had exactly 2 other occupants other than Nick and the cloaked person who tossed him away after they landed. One was an exotic snake that looked like a strange mix of python and viper with the size of the former. The other was a pale-veined bald man with red eyes and no nose that had a cold smile on his face, Voldemort. Chapter 364, Tricked. And so it is that we finally meet, the last true descendants of Slytherin and Ravenclaw, both in the Isles. If only you hadn't touched that which I hold most precious above all else, perhaps you could have joined me as I built a new world, a better one. Voldemort said with a faint and raspy voice that gave Nick goosebumps. If nothing else, he could admit that the man was creepy as hell in person. He sensed Voldemort's magic and confirmed the unrepairable taint and decay that filled his sizable mana reserves. I pity you. Nick said honestly, which caused Voldemort to frown but wait for an explanation. Born under the effects of a love potion and thus incapable of feeling it yourself, left in a Muggle orphanage where you came to be entranced by your own power and got a taste for domination. Studied at Hogwarts and had a great future ahead of you only to throw it away for a flawed and pathetic attempt at immortality. Such a waste. Nick explained disdainfully. Anger flashed in Voldemort's red eyes and he visibly snarled Crucio. He pointed his wand at Nick and shouted. Nick felt the spell take hold and send horrible pain through his body, but he quickly forced the magic out with his own. For a normal wizard this was impossible, but for him he merely needed to put the full force of his soul behind it to reject the magic forcefully. He didn't need a Mediwitch to understand that brief exposure to the curse was enough to fry a few of his nerves. So the usual methods won't work on you then, it's a good thing that I anticipated this and prepared accordingly. Voldemort said with a cold sneer after his spell was stopped. He walked over to a nearby table that had been covered with a cloth and removed the covering dramatically. There laid out on the table were various torture devices, all designed to cause as much pain as possible. I do hate getting my hands dirty, but for you I'll make an exception. Try not to break too soon, won't you? Voldemort said sadistically as he held a razor and pliers and walked over to within striking distance of Nick. What happened next could be described as chaos, as Nick immediately burned through the ropes binding him with his bloodline magic and summoned his ring to him. Before Voldemort could react, the black formless ring appeared on Nick's pointer finger. He grabbed the man by the wrist, ignoring the razor that was cutting into him from Voldemort's reaction. With another move both of them vanished into the realm, leaving both Nagini and the cloaked figure in surprise and shock as it all happened too fast to interfere. Meanwhile Nick and Voldemort landed unceremoniously inside the realm, but at different locations as per Nick's will. Holding out his left hand, his wand appeared in it and he shuddered as the connection was re-established before pointing at his wound episki. He spoke and the mending charm went to work closing the nasty gash. "Where is this? What have you done?" Voldemort demanded the moment he noticed the wrongness of the surroundings. The sun was tiny. There was no stars or clouds or sky really, and the curvature of the ground was all wrong, as if the earth was barely the size of a house. Arda Milmi, or the realm of avarice if you prefer. A small pocket world belonging to me and a terrible place for my enemies to find themselves. Nick said calmly, since his victory was guaranteed at this point. Once in the realm he was basically God, as he could manipulate the fabric of space freely and rearrange the entire realm just as easily. Whatever found itself in the realm was subjected to his laws and rules. With a raise of his hand, hundreds of golden arrows flew from the ground and covered the space overhead in an instant as they all aimed at Voldemort. "Relish in your short-lived victory while you can, brat, for I shall return to exact my vengeance," Voldemort said angrily after realizing that his situation was hopeless. Nick laughed at that for a moment before explaining to the man that these arrows don't only destroy the body but also the soul and magic, meaning there was no future resurrection for him. Voldemort screamed and raged in fear and anger after hearing this, but Nick coldly dropped his hand and the hundreds of arrows descended upon the flawed lich. Voldemort struggled in vain with any spell he could think of, including Fiend Fire, but all proved helpless before the soul-shot arrow rain. Chapter 365, Grindelwald. Nick didn't waste the power of Voldemort though after his death, as once it had been purified by the arrows attacking it, he was left with roughly half of the original mana that dispersed into the realm freely. Thanks to this, the ambient mana was now just barely below the level it was in Hogwarts. Nick took his time rearming himself with all his protective artifacts as well as his wand, and then left the realm ready to fight it out with Nagini and the cloaked figure. However, to his great surprise, Nagini was already dead and the cloaked figure was not alone in the room. A middle-aged looking man with short white hair and two different eye colors stood there with a gentle smile as the cloaked figure was kneeling behind him. Nick froze at the sight of this and paled immediately, since he recognized the man from old news clippings printed over 50 years ago. Gellert Grindelwald was here. "Calm yourself, child, neither I nor my associate mean you any harm." The Dark Lord spoke softly but with an authority that was hard to ignore. Nick did not relax, however, but was readying every defensive artifact he had on him. Grindelwald merely sighed after seeing this. It is good that you are cautious, as that is a trait that will take you far in life, but if I wanted to harm you— Grindelwald spoke but paused briefly as he waved his hand and his features blurred like mud and rearranged themselves into a face Nick had gotten very familiar with over the summer. Mr. Crumonti. I had plenty of opportunities. He finished saying with a new voice. So that's why they can't seem to find out where you are hiding from? Nick exclaimed in realization. Grindelwald cancelled his transfiguration and chuckled. Yes, I have been operating right under their noses this whole time. It was disappointingly easy, to be honest with you, with how horribly inefficient the Aurors are after receiving such a pitiful amount of funding. I can't say that it wasn't a good move from Fudge in the beginning, as the community truly needed the funds elsewhere, but his mistake was not fixing the funding after his goals were met. Did you know that not a single Auror even checked the restaurant at all during this whole time? It's disappointing to say the least. He said casually. Why are you here? Why reveal your hiding place to me now specifically? Nick asked, confused. Because the time was right, of course. Grindelwald said, motioning to his silver eye. I saw this scenes leading up to this moment months ago and began orchestrating things to fall perfectly into place while I worked towards my grand goal. First I placed my associate by that man's side and had him slowly influence Voldemort's decisions until he finally brought about his own doom, or I assume that is the case since he never reappears in this world after today. He explained honestly. So you can't see within that place then? Nick said, understanding the clues he was being given. That place is a world unto itself, and so its fate is separate to this world's and thus outside of my sight. Besides, it is not as though I always see the future with this eye, merely that it grants me the occasional glimpse of what will come or what may come. It is why I left my confinement in Nurmengard, you know. I saw the future that you may bring about and wished to aid you in this regard. Grindelwald explained warmly. My only dream for as long as I can remember was to see wizardkind set free from this self-imposed prison we have created and to truly influence the world. Sadly, the methods I chose previously would have failed even if I won that duel, a fact I learned only a year after the event. The terms of my incarceration were quite ironclad in that I was not allowed to leave if I held any thoughts on ruling when the dust settles. But why would I lead wizards forward when a far better option already existed? You asked me why I revealed myself to you now earlier. The answer is because my work in Europe has finished, and so it is time I leave this place until the rest is finished. Before I left, however, I wished to speak with you without any disguises. It is at this point, however, that I will bid you adieu for now, as Albus shall be arriving momentarily. Grindelwald said before he and the cloaked figure vanished with a loud pop. Just as the man said, Dumbledore appeared in a blaze of fire with Fawkes while his wand was at the ready.